Position 1. The brain does it. The obvious answer is that consciousness is simply what the brain does. 3 pounds of tissue, around 86 billion neurons firing in patterns. You are the pattern. Thought is chemistry. Feeling is chemistry. Memory is chemistry. Turn the brain off and consciousness disappears. That is about as solid as evidence gets. And the brain has earned that confidence. It makes up only about 2% of your body weight, yet consumes roughly 20% of your energy. It never really stops. Even while you sleep, it is regulating your breathing, consolidating memories, monitoring the world, preparing you for tomorrow. So why look anywhere else? Francis Crick, the scientist who co-discovered the structure of DNA, spent the latter part of his career pursuing exactly this idea. He put it bluntly: your joys and sorrows, your memories, your sense of who you are nothing more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells. Crick and neuroscientist Christoph Koch went looking for the precise brain activity responsible for consciousness. Keep Koch's name in mind. He comes back later, and it's not what you think. The case for the brain is extraordinarily strong. Damage the brain, and the mind changes. Alter the brain chemically, and consciousness changes. Put the brain into deep anesthesia, and conscious experience can disappear. Brain and mind rise and fall together. So maybe that's it. Maybe consciousness is simply what happens when enough neurons do the right things in the right patterns. Except, there is one question this explanation does not answer. And it is the question that has haunted the entire field. Imagine that you could describe your brain completely. Every neuron, every connection, every chemical reaction, every electrical pulse, every signal moving through every circuit. You could explain exactly what the brain does from beginning to end, and you would still be missing something. You would have described everything, except why any of it feels like anything. Why should 3 pounds of firing cells inside a dark skull produce the warmth of being loved? The dread before bad news? The ache of missing someone? Why isn't all of this processing happening in the dark, with nobody home? In 1995, philosopher David Chalmers gave this problem its now famous name: the hard problem of consciousness. The so-called easy problems ask how the brain processes information, controls behavior, recognizes objects, stores memories, and reports its internal states. The hard problem asks something much stranger. Why is any of that processing accompanied by experience at all? Why is there something it is like to be you? Nobody has solved that problem. Not yet. And that leaves the first position in a strange place. The brain clearly does something essential. But maybe it doesn't explain consciousness. So the next position makes a radical move. It says, maybe consciousness isn't something the brain produces, because consciousness is an illusion. Maybe consciousness doesn't exist at all. Not the brain, not your thoughts, not your memories. The thing that may be an illusion is the feeling itself. This is called illusionism, and it is one of the boldest positions in the entire debate. Because think about what you are most certain of. You can doubt the outside world. You can doubt your memories. You can even doubt whether other people are conscious. But you cannot seem to doubt this. I am experiencing something right now. There is something it feels like to be me. Illusionism says that certainty is exactly where you go wrong. Its most famous defender, philosopher Daniel Dennett, used a simple metaphor: a magic trick. A magician makes a woman disappear. You see her walk into a box, and a second later, she's gone. The disappearance feels completely real as an experience, but there is no mysterious act of vanishing happening inside the box. There is machinery, trapdoors, mirrors, controlled attention. The trick isn't that nothing happened. The trick is that what happened is not what you thought happened. Dennett says consciousness works the exact same way. Inside your skull, neurons fire, signals move, and information is processed. All of that is real. But we then add something extra. We imagine that somewhere behind the machinery there's a private inner theater, a little observer sitting inside watching the movie. And that, the illusionist says, is the mistake. There is no inner spectator. There is no mysterious inner glow sitting behind the neural machinery. There is only the machinery itself, doing extraordinarily complicated things. The feeling that there is a further thing to explain is the illusion. And if that is right, it solves the hard problem in one brutal stroke. Why can't neuroscience find the thing that makes neurons feel like something? Because there is no extra thing to find. The brain doesn't produce consciousness. It produces behavior, memories, attention, and an elaborate story about what is happening inside you. The story feels like consciousness, but there is nothing behind the story. And for a while, that is remarkably persuasive. Until you hit the wall. You can call consciousness an illusion, but an illusion is still an experience. Suppose you burn your hand. By reflex, your nerves fire, you pull your hand away, and you scream. But calling the pain an illusion doesn't work. You very much feel it, as a real thing. And that is the crack in illusionism. Even if you call your conscious experience an illusion, it is still an experience. So the next position makes a different move. It refuses to explain consciousness away. It accepts the feeling as completely real. But then it has to answer a much harder question. If consciousness is real, why does it seem to do absolutely nothing? This theory keeps your inner experience, but takes away its job. The name is Epiphenomenalism. The classic version goes back to the biologist Thomas Huxley, who described consciousness with a wonderfully strange metaphor: a steam whistle on a locomotive. The engine does the work. The whistle makes a tremendous noise, but it does not drive the train. It is real. It is loud. It is just not doing anything. On this view, that is consciousness. Your brain does the work. Your thoughts, feelings, and decisions are produced by physical processes in the brain. And then somehow, consciousness appears alongside them. You genuinely feel pain. You genuinely feel yourself making a decision. You genuinely experience the world. But none of that experience is actually steering the machinery. The brain is driving the train. Consciousness is the whistle. And that sounds almost impossible to believe, because surely when you decide to move your hand, you are the one deciding. So scientists began asking a strange question. Can we see what the brain is doing before you become consciously aware of making a choice? In the 1980s, Benjamin Libet tried. He connected people to equipment that could measure their brain activity and asked them to choose, whenever they wanted, when to move a finger. What he found was startling. A measurable pattern of brain activity, called the readiness potential, began building before participants reported becoming consciously aware of their intention to move. The brain signal came first. The reported feeling of deciding came later. Now, that does not prove that your brain secretly makes every decision before you do. The interpretation of Libet's experiment has been debated for decades, but it created a deeply uncomfortable possibility. What if the conscious feeling of choosing is not what causes the action? What if it is something the brain becomes aware of after the machinery has already started moving? Think about what that would mean. The brain prepares the action. The body carries it out. And consciousness experiences the decision as though it were the author, like a caption appearing underneath a scene that has already been filmed. That is the epiphenomenalist nightmare. The feeling is real, but maybe it is not doing the work. And if that is true, we have a much bigger problem. Why does consciousness exist at all? If pain does not cause you to pull your hand away, but the neural machinery does, then evolution selected the neural machinery. What did it select the pain for? If the conscious feeling of choosing does not influence the choice, why would natural selection preserve the feeling? Why have an inner movie if the machinery behind the screen is doing everything anyway? This is where epiphenomenalism becomes almost impossible to swallow, because consciousness is not some tiny decorative feature of the brain. It is the one thing you cannot get rid of from the inside: the pain, the color, the fear, the feeling of being here. And yet this theory says all of it might be causally powerless. A passenger on a train that was already moving. So perhaps the problem is not that consciousness has no job. Perhaps the problem is that we have been asking the wrong question from the beginning. We keep assuming the brain produces consciousness. But what if it doesn't? What if the relationship runs in the opposite direction? Position 3 left us with a puzzle. Consciousness seems useless, yet it is undeniably here. So the next thinkers try a completely different approach. Stop asking what consciousness is made of and start asking what it does. Their answer is that consciousness is integrated information. When a system pulls a lot of information together into a single unified whole, that unity is experience, not a byproduct of it, the thing itself. This is the most mathematical theory on the map. It is called integrated information theory, built by neuroscientist Giulio Tononi and later joined by Christoph Koch, the same guy from Position 1, still hunting consciousness in the machinery. Here's what makes their theory different from everything before it. They gave consciousness a number. They call it phi. Phi measures how much a system is more than the sum of its parts, how tightly its information is woven together. A pile of sand has a phi of nearly 0. Each grain sits alone, connected to nothing. Your brain, with 86 billion neurons wired into one dense web, has enormous phi. That number is not a sign of consciousness. It is consciousness, measured. That is a genuinely new idea. For the first time, consciousness becomes a quantity you could, in principle, read off a machine. A meter for the inner light. But follow the number where it leads, and it walks straight off a cliff. If consciousness is just integrated information, then anything that integrates information has some, not just wet brains. A silicon circuit, a network, even a proton, because its parts interact. Which means consciousness is not special to living things. It is smeared across the entire universe, in tiny amounts, everywhere. The philosopher John Searle heard this and scoffed. He said the theory spreads consciousness across the cosmos like a thin layer of jam. And it got hotter than a metaphor. In 2023, 124 scientists and philosophers signed an open letter branding integrated information theory pseudoscience. The backlash to the backlash was just as loud. Many in the field thought pseudoscience was a smear and said so in public. The argument is still burning. But underneath the fight sits the deeper problem the number never solves. Even if you measure phi perfectly, even if the meter works, it still does not say why a high number should feel like anything. You have counted the integration. You have not explained the experience. So the next position stops trying to build consciousness out of parts at all. It makes a stranger bet. Maybe consciousness was never assembled. Maybe it was there from the start. Position 5, everything. Every position so far has tried to build consciousness out of something that is not conscious. Neurons, information, computation, machinery, and everyone eventually hits the same wall. How do you get an inside experience out of parts that have no inside experience at all? So this position makes a startling move. It stops trying. Instead, it asks, what if the feeling was there from the start? What if consciousness does not suddenly appear when matter becomes sufficiently complicated? What if consciousness goes all the way down? This is called Panpsychism, and the name makes it sound like mysticism. The idea is that consciousness is a fundamental feature of reality, present even in the smallest pieces of matter. Most people hear that and laugh, until they hear the argument for it. Physics is spectacularly good at describing what matter does, how electrons behave, how mass curves space-time, how particles interact. But notice what physics does not tell you. What is any of that stuff like? From the inside. And there is exactly one piece of matter in the universe for which you have access to both sides, your own brain. From the outside, you can describe it just like any other physical object. Neurons, electrical signals, chemical reactions, billions of cells communicating with one another. But you also know the brain from the inside, because you are the thing it feels like to be. And from the inside, what you encounter is consciousness. Now the panpsychist asks a deceptively simple question. What if your brain is not the exception? What if the difference between an electron and a human is not whether there is consciousness, but how much? The electron has the faintest primitive flicker. The human, something extraordinarily complex. So the reframe here is that the brain does not produce consciousness. Consciousness is what matter already is, simply viewed from within. This is the position defended today by philosophers such as Philip Goff, building on an idea developed nearly a century ago by physicist Arthur Eddington. You might think the hard problem is solved. There is no need to explain how dead matter suddenly produces mind because matter was never entirely non-conscious to begin with. Now, this does not mean your chair has opinions. The claim is only about fundamental particles. Everyday objects are just arrangements of those bits, and an arrangement doesn't automatically get its own mind, which brings us to the problem that threatens to crack the whole theory open. If every fundamental particle has its own tiny fragment of experience, then your brain contains an astronomical number of these little flickers. But you do not experience yourself as an astronomical number of tiny minds. You experience one thing, one continuous field of awareness, one perspective, one I. So how do all those microscopic experiences become one conscious experience? How do countless little flickers combine into the single mind watching this video right now? That question has a name, the combination problem. Panpsychism explains why consciousness need not emerge from dead matter, but it cannot explain how many tiny minds become one. The next position keeps panpsychism's core position that consciousness really is fundamental, but instead of looking inside ordinary matter for the answer, it looks somewhere much stranger. It looks to the place where physics itself begins to come apart. Quantum. The last position said consciousness is fundamental, woven into matter, but it choked on one question: how do countless tiny pieces of experience combine into one mind? This next position looks for the answer in the deepest, strangest layer of reality we know, the quantum world. Maybe we've been looking at the brain at the wrong scale. Classical physics sees neurons as wet biological machines, firing signals and moving chemicals. But what if that's just the surface? What if the real action is happening much deeper, in quantum events inside the neurons? This idea came from Sir Roger Penrose, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, and Stuart Hameroff, an anesthesiologist. They pointed to microscopic hollow tubes inside your neurons called microtubules. Their theory, Orch-OR, claims that quantum states collapse inside these tubes, and that each collapse could produce a single flash of conscious experience. Your mind, on this picture, isn't just neurons firing. It's a stream of quantum events. Why would an anesthesiologist care? Because of a question that sounds simple and isn't. When you go under, your experience vanishes completely, and we still do not fully understand how a drug erases the entire world of the mind. Hameroff noticed that anesthetics act on those very microtubules, which hinted that whatever they switch off might be happening down there. For years, the theory was treated as impossible. In 2000, physicist Max Tegmark argued the brain is far too warm and wet to hold a delicate quantum state. Beautiful idea, biologically hopeless. Except it hasn't quite died. Recent experiments have reported quantum-like vibrations inside microtubules, and fresh work on anesthetics acting on them. That does not mean Orch-OR is proven. It isn't. Most neuroscientists remain skeptical, and there's still no established evidence that microtubule quantum processes produce consciousness. But the theory has survived long enough to stay interesting. And notice the trap. Even if Penrose and Hameroff are right, you haven't solved the mystery. You've only moved it. Why should a quantum event feel like anything? Why should a collapsing quantum state produce the experience of red or pain or the sound of music? Quantum mechanics might tell us where it happens. It still can't tell us why there's an experience on the inside. Every position so far assumes consciousness happens inside physical reality. The next position asks a far more radical question. What if that entire picture is backwards? Every position so far has been an argument. Smart people, reasoning from the outside, trying to figure out what consciousness must be. But there is another way to investigate consciousness. You don't have to reason about it from the outside. You can change it directly from the inside and see what happens. And when a few hard-nosed scientists finally did that, it rattled them. Remember Christoph Koch from the very beginning of this video? Francis Crick's collaborator, the man hunting consciousness in the machinery of the brain. For decades, Koch was not just any materialist. He wrote an entire book with a title he chose for himself, Confessions of a Romantic Reductionist. Reductionist because he believed consciousness would reduce to neurons firing, nothing more. That was his life's work. Then, in his 60s, Koch took a high dose of a psychedelic, and what he experienced did not fit inside the worldview he had defended for 40 years. He described it as hyperreality, not a hallucination, not a dream, something that felt, in his own words, more real than ordinary waking life. More vivid, more true, more there than the sober world he returned to. Sit with how strange that is. A leading brain scientist, a man who spent his career insisting experience is just chemistry, has an experience so overwhelming that the everyday world starts to look like the illusion, and the altered state looks like the truth. It didn't turn Koch into a mystic. He is still a scientist. But it cracked something open. It made a lifelong reductionist willing to entertain an idea he would have once laughed at. What if consciousness isn't a small thing the brain produces, but something far larger than the brain that the brain merely tunes into? And here's what makes this more than one man's strange night. The exact same experience shows up again and again, across thousands of people, across cultures that never touched each other. Vast geometric spaces, contorted snake-like architectures, a feeling of encountering something older, vaster, and infinitely more real than the ordinary self. Reports that echo each other from people separated by oceans, centuries, and languages. Now, the careful scientist has a simple answer ready. Our brains share the same hardware, so when you disrupt them, they break down in similar ways. That is a reasonable explanation, and it may well be right. But it raises the radical question this final position is built on. If altering the brain doesn't just dim consciousness, but expands it, what exactly is the brain doing? Is it producing your experience, or is it limiting it? Think about a radio. A radio doesn't create the music. It receives and filters an invisible signal, squeezing a massive electromagnetic broadcast down into the speaker. If you smash the radio, the music stops in the room, but that doesn't mean the radio created the broadcast. This, of course, is Aldous Huxley's framing from The Doors of Perception. So, what if the brain is working the same way? Not as a builder, but as a filter. A reducing valve, narrowing an infinite field of awareness down into the thin, survival-driven trickle you call everyday life. That single question turns our entire map upside down. Every position so far assumed the brain builds consciousness up, out of neurons, out of information, out of quantum events. This position asks the exact opposite. What if the brain isn't a builder at all? What if consciousness isn't inside the brain, but the brain is inside consciousness? Position 8, the self. The last position turned consciousness inside out. Maybe the brain does not build experience. Maybe it filters it. But there is one thing that idea leaves standing. One thing that still feels rock solid. You. The one having all these experiences. The self at the center of it all, watching the show. Every position so far has argued about what consciousness is. None has questioned who is having it. That seems like the one safe assumption in the whole video. There is experience, and there is a you that the experience is happening to. So let us do to the self what we did to everything else. Let us go looking for it. Here's an experiment you can run right now, and it is almost 300 years old. In the 1730s, the philosopher David Hume tried to find himself. Not his body, his self. The inner observer he was sure sat behind his eyes, having his life. He looked inward, carefully, the way a scientist examines evidence, and he reported something startling. He could not find it. Every time he went looking, he wrote, he stumbled on a perception instead. Heat or cold, light or shadow, love or hatred, a thought, a feeling, a sensation. He could catch those all day long. But the self that was supposedly having them, the one doing the looking, he never once caught it. So Hume drew a radical conclusion. Maybe there is no inner observer at all. Maybe what you call I is not a thing that has experiences. Maybe it is just the experiences themselves, a bundle of sensations rushing by so fast that it creates the illusion of someone sitting behind them. Try it yourself right now. Look for the one who is watching, not your thoughts, the thinker, not your feelings, the feeler. Go find the self that is having this experience of watching a video. You will find the screen. You will find thoughts about the video. You will not find the watcher. Wherever you turn your attention, there is only ever another experience, never the one having it. The neuroscientist and philosopher Sam Harris puts it in a sharp image. We live with the constant feeling that there is a rider on the horse of consciousness, a little self up there, steering, watching, in control. But when you actually look for the rider closely and patiently, there is no rider. There is only the horse. Actions happen, thoughts appear, and then a split second later, another thought appears, saying, I did that. There was never a little self behind your eyes running the show. There is just experience happening, and a very convincing story that someone is having it. And this is not just a Western philosophy idea. It is the exact same thing contemplatives in the East have reported for over 2,000 years. Look for the self, and it dissolves. The Buddhist tradition built an entire practice around this discovery, giving it a name centuries before Hume, anatta, no self. Two traditions, separated by half the world and 2,000 years, ran the same inward experiment and came back with the same impossible result. The thing you are most certain of, the you at the center of your life, is the one thing you can never actually find. So now the ground is gone. There is no separate observer standing outside consciousness, looking in, which opens the door to the most radical position of all. Because if consciousness is not produced by the brain, and there is no separate self inside it, then maybe consciousness is not a part of reality at all. Maybe it is the whole thing. Position 9, Idealism. For 8 positions, we have been trying to fit consciousness into the physical world, into neurons, into information, into computation, into quantum events, and every single time, something leaked out that would not fit. So this position makes the most radical move available. It stops trying to fit consciousness into reality. It says reality fits inside consciousness. This is idealism. Not the everyday meaning of chasing ideals, but the philosophical claim. Consciousness is not just one more thing inside the universe. It is the fundamental fabric, and everything else, matter, space, your body, this screen, is something happening within it. Flip the whole picture. You have always assumed consciousness happens inside the world. Idealism says the world happens inside consciousness. Now, the moment anyone hears this, an obvious objection fires. If everything is just mind, why is the world so stubbornly there? Why can't you change it by wishing? Why do we all see the same moon? A shared, solid, independent world is the whole reason we believed in physical matter in the first place. The philosopher who has answered this most rigorously is Bernardo Kastrup, and he is no armchair mystic guessing in the dark. He holds 2 PhDs, one in philosophy and one in computer engineering, and spent years as a scientist working at CERN, the largest particle physics laboratory on Earth. This is a hard-nosed technical mind arguing that reality is mental. His answer to the solid world problem comes from psychiatry: dissociation, considered dissociative identity disorder. A single human mind splits into separate personalities, called alters. Each alter has its own memories, its own perspective, and its own feeling of being completely separate from the others. One mind partitioned into centers that cannot reach into each other. Now scale that up. Kastrup argues that reality is one vast field of universal consciousness, and each of us, every living thing, is a dissociated alter of that mind. A pocket where the universal mind has walled off a small piece of itself and forgotten it is the whole. You are not consciousness looking out at a physical world. You are universal consciousness that has closed a boundary, experiencing itself from a single perspective. And this isn't just a clever metaphor. In a documented 2015 medical study, doctors examined a woman with dissociative identity disorder whose alters had different levels of vision. In some personality states, she could see normally. In others, using the exact same eyes and the exact same brain, she was functionally blind. One brain, the same eyes, and yet genuinely different vision. If a single human mind can wall off experience so completely that the body itself responds differently, then the idea that a universal mind could dissociate into billions of separate perspectives stops sounding impossible. Matter is simply what the rest of that universal mind looks like when viewed from inside your own boundary. For most of the last century, idealism was treated as a pre-scientific fairy tale. Today, it is returning. Argued not by mystics, but by physicists and philosophers who realize the purely physical story keeps failing at the one thing it was supposed to explain. So we have reached the far end of our map. From the brain is a machine all the way to the universe is a mind, which would seem to be the end. 9 positions from the ordinary to the unthinkable. Except there is one final position left, and it does not sit at either end of this map. It stands outside the whole thing and asks whether the answer was ever findable at all. Every position in this video, all 9 of them, shares one silent assumption: that the answer is out there to be found. That consciousness is a lock and somewhere there is a key. The materialist looks for it in neurons. The idealist looks for it in mind. They disagree about almost everything except this: that a human being is capable of understanding the answer. The final position doubts that. It is called Mysterianism, and it makes a claim stranger than anything before it. The problem of consciousness may be real, natural, and have a perfectly good answer, and we may simply never be able to grasp it. Not because we haven't tried hard enough, because our minds are not built to. The philosopher Colin McGinn put this forward, and his argument is uncomfortably simple. Every kind of mind has limits. A dog cannot learn calculus, not because the dog is lazy, but because a dog's brain doesn't have the hardware. A squirrel will never understand quantum mechanics. A cat will never grasp prime numbers. Every other creature on Earth has a ceiling, a point where certain problems become permanently invisible to it. Now, here's the humbling question almost nobody asks. Why would humans be the one species with no ceiling at all? We take it for granted that we can understand anything given enough time, but that is a strange assumption to make about one particular primate. What if the answer to consciousness sits above our ceiling? What if the answer is like ultraviolet light, real, present, everywhere, and forever outside what our eyes can see? McGinn's phrase for this is cognitive closure. The answer could be sitting right in front of us, written in our genes, and still be something a human brain can no more comprehend than a dog can comprehend the stock market. Not everyone accepts this. Daniel Dennett dismissed it as giving up before the work is done. Yet even Steven Pinker, one of the most confident champions of science explaining the mind, has acknowledged that our brains may simply not be built to grasp it. When even the optimists start hedging, the mystery is doing something unusual. And now, look back at where we started. Remember the strange fact from the beginning of this video, that consciousness is the only field where the more we learn, the more theories we get. Hundreds of them, and climbing. We treated that as a puzzle to be solved. But Mysterianism offers a darker, more elegant reading of that same fact. What if the explosion of theories is not a sign that we are getting closer? What if it is the exact opposite? When a problem is solvable, answers converge. Physics narrowed, biology narrowed. But when a problem sits above our ceiling, theories do not converge, they multiply. Every brilliant mind grabs a different corner of something too big to hold, and none of them can ever assemble the whole. Hundreds of competing theories is not the sound of a field closing in on an answer. It may be the sound of a species trying to see its own eyes. And that is the deepest strangeness of consciousness. It is the one thing in the universe you are absolutely certain of. You are experiencing it right now, in the very act of trying to understand it. It is closer to you than anything else there is. And it may be the one thing you were built never to understand. We began with a simple question. What is consciousness? 10 positions later, the most honest answer might be the one that is hardest to accept. That the thing doing the asking may never be able to answer. And that the question itself, the impossible, undeniable fact of your own inner experience, is not a problem waiting to be solved. It is the deepest mystery you will ever be.